Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to, a place I'm sure you've all heard of, Tiananmen Square.
Yeah.
But you're interested in more than just the 1989 protests, right? You want to understand the real weight of this place, historically and politically.
Exactly. We want to look at Tiananmen Square not just as a physical space, right?
Right.
But as a place where power and symbolism have been, negotiated for centuries. We're going to dive into an academic paper called Tiananmen Square and the Politics of Place.
Okay.
It was published in Political Geography back in 1993 by Linda Hershkovitz. Did you know that Tiananmen Square's history actually dates back to the 14th century?
Wow. Okay.
And that its design was really tied in with Chinese cosmology.
See, that's what I love about these deep dives.
Yeah.
Always learning something new.
Right.
It's easy to focus on the familiar pictures and headlines, but there's always so much more to it.
Oh, absolutely.
So our expert today is going to help us unpack it all. They are an expert in the historical and political geography of China, which is perfect for this.
Absolutely.
So how do we start to see Tiananmen Square through this politics of place lens? What does that even mean?
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept. Basically, politics of place argues that political actions actually shape physical spaces.
Okay.
And then, in turn, those spaces influence future political actions. So you have this feedback loop where the built environment almost becomes its own actor, full of history and meaning.
So it's not just a one-way street. The space isn't passive. It pushes back, right?
Exactly.
Which shapes the events that happen there.
Precisely. One way this happens is through how oppositional groups use space. They take spaces that those in power control.
Okay.
And then they appropriate them and transform them, making them a platform for their own message.
I see. So it's like turning the tables, using the system against itself.
Yeah.
But isn't there a risk that by using these state-controlled spaces and symbols, they sort of give power to the very thing they're challenging?
That is a great question. And it's a tension that runs through the entire history of Tiananmen Square. Think of it this way, okay? Oppositional groups often use a tactic called detournement. So they're taking elements of the existing order and using them for a completely new purpose. They're basically hijacking their meaning.
Ah, got it.
It's not about supporting the state's power,
Right.
but exposing its weaknesses.
It's like using your parents' favorite record to make a DIY clock.
Right.
You're not saying, oh, I love this record, but you're using it to make a statement.
That is a perfect analogy.
Nice.
This idea of detournement is crucial for understanding how Tiananmen Square has been used, and contested over time.
Got it. So let's go back in time. We're talking about a space with centuries of history.
Right.
Tell me about its beginnings.
Okay, well, the story of Tiananmen Square begins way back in the 14th century during the Ming Dynasty.
Okay.
And, it might surprise you to learn that the square wasn't just randomly placed. It was designed according to Chinese cosmology.
Specifically, this idea of a cosmo-magical city. Think of Beijing as this big representation of the cosmos, all right?
Okay.
And right at the center, you had the Forbidden City, with the emperor representing the sun.
So all those walls and gates surrounding the Forbidden City, were they like the layers of heaven?
Yeah.
Separating the sacred from the ordinary world.
You got it. The walls and gates were hugely important for creating a hierarchy of space. The closer you were to the emperor, the more sacred the space. And the further away you moved, the less sacred it became.
So where did Tiananmen Square fit into all of this? Was it like a public gathering place back then?
Not in the way we think of it today. Tiananmen, the Gate of Heavenly Peace, was the grand entrance to the Forbidden City. And the area in front of it, what we call Tiananmen Square, was like a transitional space.
Okay.
Between the emperor's sacred world and the outside world.
I see.
So semi-public, used for things like military parades, imperial announcements. Ordinary people didn't just hang out there.
Right.
It was about control and careful displays of imperial power. So not exactly the bustling public square we think of today. The images we have of Tiananmen Square are usually packed with people. When did that change happen, that shift to a more public space?
Yeah, well, a big turning point was the Nationalist Revolution in 1911. So the Forbidden City, once the exclusive domain of the emperor, was opened up to the public. This totally changed the spatial dynamics of the city.
Wow, that's a huge symbolic shift in power.
Exactly. And along with this shift, Tiananmen Square began to take on new roles too. It became a kind of informal marketplace, a public gathering space.
Okay.
And really importantly, a place for political protest.
So this is where we really see those politics of place in action.
Yeah, you got it. And the 1919 May 4th incident was a key moment here. So thousands of students protesting against the government's response to the Treaty of Versailles, they converged on Tiananmen Square. They made it their main rallying point.
So from a space for controlled imperial rituals to a platform for mass protest, that's quite a change.
It was. And that event set a precedent. Throughout the 20th century, Tiananmen Square, with its history and central location, became the go-to place for voicing dissent.
I'm guessing the authorities weren't too happy about that.
Not really, no. They tried different ways to restrict access, tried to control the narrative, but the meaning of the square had already changed. It wasn't just a symbol of imperial power anymore.
Right.
It was also a symbol of resistance, a place where people could challenge the status quo.
It's interesting how a single space can have such different, almost contradictory meanings.
Right. It's like a battleground for ideologies.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And this battle intensified when the communists came to power in 1949. They had a unique challenge.
Yeah.
How to reconcile their revolutionary ideology with the need to establish their own legitimacy, their authority.
So how did that play out in terms of the space? Did they just start over, like redesign Tiananmen Square from scratch?
Not quite. They took a more, I guess you could say, nuanced approach. Instead of wiping out the past entirely, they combined revolutionary symbolism with elements from the previous regimes.
Interesting.
So they created this kind of hybrid space. It reflected both continuity and change.
Okay, so walk me through some of their decisions. What did they change? What did they keep? And how did it reflect this balancing act they were trying to pull off?
Well, some of the biggest changes were like the new monuments they added. They built the Great Hall of the People, the Museum of the Chinese Revolution.
Right.
And most importantly, right in the middle of the square, the Monument to the People's Heroes.
Ah, yes. That huge obelisk. I remember seeing photos, those bas-reliefs depicting scenes from China's revolutionary history. It's quite a striking structure.
It was designed to be. They didn't forget about Chairman Mao either. His giant portrait was put right above Tiananmen, overlooking the square.
So they were really making their mark on the space, both literally and figuratively.
Exactly. But it's interesting what they didn't change, too. They kept the Forbidden City, for example, but its symbolic importance was, diminished. It became a museum, a relic of the past, while Tiananmen Square was the stage for the new regime's displays of power. I think massive parades, huge rallies, ceremonies, all about showing unity and national pride under communist rule.
But, by keeping elements of the previous regime, didn't they risk seeming, hypocritical? After all, they were supposed to be revolutionaries, breaking with the past. How did they make that work?
Well, they presented it as building on the achievements of China's history while also leading the nation towards a socialist future.
Okay.
They were very strategic about this mix of old and new. It was like they were saying, we are the rightful successors, the inheritors of China's great legacy.
So it was about claiming continuity, but also control. Did this approach work? Did it stop the dissenting voices?
Well, not entirely. That tension between control and dissent, it kept simmering under the surface. And just a few years later, in 1976, Tiananmen Square became the stage for another huge protest, the April 5th incident.
Remind me what happened there. I'm not as familiar with that one.
Well, it started as a spontaneous outpouring of grief for Zhou Enlai, the premier who had died recently. People gathered in Tiananmen Square to mourn him, laying wreaths, reciting poems at the monument to the people's heroes.
But it didn't end there, did it?
No, it became something more. In the midst of the mourning, people started criticizing Mao, the Cultural Revolution, the direction of the country. Essentially, they were using the space and symbols of the communist regime to express their dissatisfaction with the regime itself.
Sounds like another example of detournement, taking the tools of the powerful to challenge the powerful.
Precisely. And the government's response was quick and harsh. They saw this public criticism as a threat to their authority, and they moved to suppress it.
Okay.
Police and soldiers cleared the square. There was violence, arrests.
So even under communist rule, Tiananmen Square remained this contested space, a site where power was challenged.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the event most people associate with Tiananmen Square, the event that really brought this spatial struggle to the world's attention, the student protests of 1989.
Yes, the 1989 protests. When I think about Tiananmen Square, that's the first thing that pops into my head. The image of Tank Man, all those students, that feeling of hope, defiance, and then, of course, the tragic ending. It really captured the world's attention.
It did. And while that image of Tank Man is powerful, it's important to remember those protests were more than a single moment.
Right.
It was a weeks-long occupation of the square. And the students, they were very strategic in how they used the space, the symbolism of it all.
It feels like this is where Hershkovitz's idea of politics of place becomes so important. She wants us to see those protests not just as, being against certain policies, but as this spatial struggle for control, for meaning.
Exactly. By being in Tiananmen Square, those students rejected the place they were supposed to be in, on campuses away from the center of power.
Right.
They were directly challenging the state's control.
Right.
Not just of the physical space of Tiananmen Square, but the political space of China itself.
So they were saying, we're not just going to sit back and watch. We're taking a stand and we want to be heard.
That's a great way to put it. And they did it in very deliberate ways. The hunger strike, drawing attention through self-sacrifice. They put up the Goddess of Democracy statue right in the square, challenging the existing symbols with their own symbols of freedom and democracy. And they disrupted official events, like Gorbachev's visit.
Right.
They were using their presence there to force their voices into the global conversation.
I visited Tiananmen Square years after the protests, and I was just struck by the sheer size of it. It's huge, almost overwhelming. You don't really get that from pictures alone. And it made me think about those students occupying that massive space for weeks. The logistics alone must have been crazy, let alone the courage to face down the government like that.
It's true. And the government's response, it was very telling. They framed the protests, especially being in the square, as a threat to order.
I see.
They used language like chaos, sacred, private, to condemn the students and their actions.
So they were tapping into those deep meanings we talked about before, that sense of the square as a place of order, national unity, as opposed to dissent or individual expression.
Exactly. They said the square was meant for these big public displays of national unity, not for the private agendas of some students, even though those students clearly represented how a lot of people felt. They made the students seem like outsiders, disrupting the harmony of the people's square.
That makes the crackdown even more disturbing. It wasn't just about stopping a protest. It was about taking back control of the narrative, reasserting their dominance over the space and its meaning.
Precisely. And they went to great lengths to do it. Just 2 weeks later, they had this victory celebration in the square. Young pioneers marching, flags, wreaths at the monument to the people's heroes. It was all very carefully staged, a display of order and unity to try to erase the memory of the student occupation.
It seems like they were doing a kind of counter-detournement, taking back those symbols and the space and pushing their own story.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. But of course, the memory of those protests, Tank Man, the stories of courage, you can't just erase those. What happened in 1989 is a part of Tiananmen Square's history now, part of its horizon of meaning, as Hershkovitz says.
Like a permanent mark, a reminder of what happened there.
Yes, exactly. It shows even the most powerful attempts to control space and meaning, they can be challenged. Tiananmen Square is still a place of contested memory. The past is still present there.
So after this deep dive, what have we learned? What's the takeaway about Tiananmen Square and the politics of place?
I think the main thing to remember is Tiananmen Square is more than just bricks and mortar. It's a place with layers of meaning, historical and political meaning.
Right.
It's been shaped by this constant struggle for control, the state versus those who challenge it.
It reminds us that spaces are never neutral. The forces of power, resistance, memory, all of that shapes them.
Exactly. It makes you think, with this long history of control versus dissent, what will happen to Tiananmen Square? Will it always be this battleground for competing narratives? Or will the state ultimately win and fix its meaning?
That is a really good question. And it applies to more than just Tiananmen Square, right? It's a question we can ask about all the places we encounter. What are their stories? What power dynamics are at play? What does the future hold for them? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the history of Tiananmen Square. We hope you'll continue to think about the places you experience in your own life and what they mean.